In this chapter, we'll be examining the processes of photosynthesis. Life is powered by sunshine. The energy used by most living cells comes ultimately from the sun, which is captured by plants and algae and some bacteria through the process of photosynthesis. So ultimately, the energy for all life on Earth comes from photosynthesis. Here's the reaction for photosynthesis. It may look sort of familiar, as it is essentially the process of respiration in reverse. In this process, we'll take carbon dioxide and stick those carbons together using the energy of sunlight. And then we'll generate glucose from the carbons and some water as a byproduct, as well as lots of oxygen. As you recognize, we inspire this oxygen and we'll release carbon dioxide. It's this very carbon dioxide that plants are able to use to build glucose using the energy from the sun. Photosynthesis occurs in a wide variety of organisms, and it comes in different forms. These include a form of photosynthesis that doesn't even produce oxygen, so it's called anoxygenic, and then a form that does produce oxygen, which is oxygenic. Mostly anoxygenic photosynthesis is found in 4 different bacterial groups. But oxygenic photosynthesis is carried out by cyanobacteria, 7 groups of algae, and all land plants, of course, that have chloroplasts. So as you'll probably recall from our chapter on cell structures, chloroplasts have 2 membranes. They're a double membrane bound organelle. And just as with mitochondria, the inner membrane undergoes some convolutions and infoldings, so it folds into the center. And rather than forming cristae that we see in the mitochondria, inside the chloroplast we have thylakoid membranes. Here you can see one thylakoid membrane. Many thylakoid membranes stacked together form a granum, which is singular for grana, which is multiple stacks of these thylakoid membranes. These grana are connected to each other through stromal lamellae. These are these small connections that you can see right here. And the fluid inside the chloroplast is called stroma. It's a semi-liquid fluid, just like we see in the matrix of the mitochondria. The thylakoid membranes contain chlorophyll and many other photosynthetic pigments, but primarily we'll be seeing chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. These pigments are clustered in photosystems right on top of these thylakoid membranes. So photosynthesis occurs in 2 primary stages. Photosynthesis occurs in 2 primary stages, the light-dependent reactions and then the light-independent reactions or carbon fixation reactions. In the light-dependent reactions, we capture energy from the sun and use it to make ATP and reduce NADP+. That is, we add 2 electrons and 2 hydrogen ions in order to form NADPH. In the light-independent reactions, or sometimes called dark reactions, we use the ATP that we generated in the light reactions, as well as the NADPH we generated in light reactions, to synthesize organic molecules from CO2. That is, essentially, we're sticking CO2s together to form glucose, using the energy from sunlight. In this figure, you can see the separation of these 2 stages. Here we have the thylakoid area. In the thylakoid area, you'll see these embedded proteins. These are photosystems and contain the photosynthetic pigments. Here is where all the light energy from sunlight is captured, and we generate ATP and NADPH. Then outside of the thylakoid, in here in the stroma, we'll see the light-independent reactions, or dark reactions, where we fix carbon using the energy trapped in ATP and NADPH. In addition to chlorophyll, there are several other photosynthetic pigments. These pigments are molecules that absorb light energy in the visible range. Light is essentially a form of energy. We often consider light in the wave form. Here we can see shorter wavelengths and then longer wavelengths of light. But we also consider the energetic aspects of light when we consider photons. Photons are particles of light. So light has both a wave and particle form, really depending on how you look at it. But energetically, we consider photons, and visually, we consider wavelengths. Photons are discrete bundles of energy, and their energy content is inversely proportional to the wavelength of light. That is, that a short wavelength photon has a lot more energy than a longer wavelength photon. The photoelectric effect is when we remove an electron from a molecule with the energy of light. This is exactly what happens in chlorophyll. Photons of light from the sun hit the pigment molecules, and electrons are removed or excited to a different energy level. Something I've always thought is interesting, just as a side note, is when we look at the whole spectrum of energy that we are able to observe. Visible light energy only occupies a very small portion of that. We have equipment that can measure all the way up to gamma rays and then radio waves. But is there anything beyond this? My inclination is to say yes, just because we can't measure it doesn't mean that there isn't more in this energetic spectrum. So there is a possibility that things exist that we cannot see or even measure. I just think that's an interesting concept to think about when we consider visible light and the spectrum. Each of the photosynthetic pigments has a different absorption spectrum. Here you can see we're looking at the carotenoids, chlorophyll A, and chlorophyll B. Those are the major three classes we'll consider. And the graph plots the absorption spectrum of each, chlorophyll A being the primary pigment, and it seems to absorb light most readily in the blue and red ranges. And this makes sense when you think about it. When you see the color green, what's happening to the light there? Is it being absorbed or reflected? And the truth is, the reason that we see green is that's the only color light that's being reflected by the pigments. So if I'm wearing a green shirt, green is being reflected back to you. It's the only pigment not absorbed. If I'm wearing a red shirt, then you're seeing red because the pigments in my shirt are reflecting red back to you, but absorbing everything else. So all you see is red. So when a photon strikes a molecule, its energy can either be lost as heat or absorbed by the electrons of that molecule. If it's absorbed by the electrons of the molecule, the energy packet boosts the electrons to a higher energy level. You'll recall the energy levels we talked about in our chemistry chapter. So simply, we're moving an electron to a different energy level. The absorption spectrum then is defined as the range and efficiency of light energy that a molecule is capable of absorbing, or the range and efficiency of the photons that a particular molecule is able to absorb. Organisms have evolved a variety of different pigments. As I've previously mentioned, we have chlorophylls and then carotenoids. In some organisms, there are other molecules that also absorb light energy, but the only ones that we'll be focusing on in this chapter are chlorophylls and carotenoids. We'll look at them in a little more detail shortly. Chlorophylls consist of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll A is the primary pigment in plants and cyanobacteria. It's the only pigment that can act directly to convert light energy to chemical energy. It absorbs in the violet and blue as well as the red light, but skips green because that's what's being reflected. Chlorophyll B, on the other hand, is an accessory pigment or secondary pigment. It absorbs light wavelengths that chlorophyll A does not absorb. So if we look back here in this diagram, you can see that chlorophyll B absorbs some of the longer wavelengths of blue light and some of the shorter wavelengths of red light, just to increase the absorption spectrum of the chloroplasts as a whole. The structure of chlorophyll consists of this very complicated porphyrin ring. Now, you don't need to know this structure, so that you can go, whew, thank goodness. But it has alternating double and single bonds, and there's a magnesium at the center. And what happens when light energy hits here is these double bonds will flop back and forth and electrons can be released. So that is, photons will excite electrons that are in this porphyrin ring structure. The electrons will be shuttled away from the ring and moved to a higher energy level. So we've already considered the absorption spectrum. The action spectrum, it makes sense, would follow the absorption spectrum and be very similar. So the action spectrum is the relative effectiveness of the different wavelengths of light at promoting photosynthesis. In this figure, you can see a filament of green algae down the center, and different regions of it are being exposed to different wavelengths of light. Around this filament, we see lots of oxygen-seeking bacteria. A byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, so you would expect an accumulation of oxygen-seeking bacteria in regions where there were higher amounts of oxygen. We're seeing that the absorption of light, as well as the action, is highest in the areas of purple and blue, as well as orange and reds. Let's take a little closer look at carotenoids. Carotenoids are carbon rings that are linked again with alternating single and double bonds. And just as with chlorophylls, the carbon rings contain alternating and double and single bonds. And these bonds, once excited by a photon of light, will switch and allow electrons to be released. The carotenoids absorb photons in a wide range of energies. In addition to their function in absorbing photons, they're also involved in scavenging free radicals that are produced by the process of capturing light energy. So, in essence, they are antioxidants and provide a protective role to the plants so that they don't get, let's say, sunburned and DNA damage. In these pictures to the right, you can see an oak leaf in the summer where it has all of its carotenoids and chlorophylls. However, in the fall, in deciduous trees, the chlorophylls are pulled back into the core of the plant and only the carotenoids remain in the leaf. Carotenoids are orange in color, and that gives us our orange and yellow and different shades of leaves that we see in the fall falling off of trees. Another class of pigments are the phycobilioproteins. These are not really seen in land plants. They increase the rate of photosynthesis in many of the deep ocean plants, allowing absorption in more of the green range because most of the algae higher in the ocean level have already absorbed most of the light in the red and blue-purple ranges. So again, phycobilioproteins allow deeper ocean plants to absorb more in the middle spectrum between the blue-purple and orange-red areas. Let's check out a quick animation to see if we can clarify some of these processes.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions. the light-dependent reactions, and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated.